Pam Bondi stood toe-to-toe with the federal judiciary and sparked a national reckoning on power, silence, and accountability. This isn't about left or right, it's about the line between justice and performance and what happens when someone dares to call it out. The news broke quietly, as legal news often does. An emergency injunction filed in the Southern District of New York, signed by Judge Elias Trenholm just minutes before a deportation flight was scheduled to depart. The order halted the removal of 47 undocumented immigrants, mostly Venezuelan nationals, citing due process violations and incomplete asylum screenings. CNN called it a humanitarian stand. The New York Times quoted immigration attorneys praising it as a rare act of judicial courage. But in an office high above Peachtree Street in downtown Atlanta, Pam Bondi watched the muted broadcast with narrowed eyes. She was alone, arms crossed, jaw set. On the screen, a commentator described Trenholm's move as activist, before quickly correcting himself, independent. Bondi didn't flinch. She reached for a pen, tapped it twice against a stack of notes, and muttered, "They're playing with fire." This wasn't the first time she'd seen a judge step beyond the confines of interpretation and into the arena of political posturing, but this one felt different. Trenholm wasn't a fringe figure. He was respected, thoughtful, even liked by both sides of the aisle, and that made him dangerous. Because when respected judges made political decisions under the guise of legality, the damage wasn't just procedural, it was cultural, institutional. Every time a judge acted like a policymaker, the foundations of separation of powers eroded just a little more, and the public's ability to tell the difference between justice and opinion grew weaker. That night, as Bondi reviewed the ruling, she saw something that others didn't: a crack in the court's armor. And she intended to drive a wedge into it. The deportation order had been expedited by DHS under mounting pressure to meet quarterly clearance quotas. The department had been criticized for delays, and now it was pushing for efficiency, fast-tracking removals, minimizing appeal windows, and treating silence from legal counsel as consent. Some of the detainees had flagged backgrounds, but others were in legal limbo, awaiting hearings that hadn't even been scheduled yet. Trenholm's ruling cited the irreparable harm caused by due process denial, but to Bondi, the language was tactical, cold. Obstruction, wrapped in judicial vocabulary, designed to slow a process the administration had deemed essential to national security. Her first call was to her deputy, the second to a producer at American Public News. "I'll take an interview tomorrow," she said, "but no scripts, no prep." The voice on the other end hesitated, then agreed. They knew what that meant. Bondi wasn't just issuing a statement, she was launching something. By morning, headlines were multiplying. Federal judge halts deportations amid legal scrutiny. Rights groups applaud last-minute court order. Pam Bondi responds, "Judges aren't kings." But the calm wouldn't last. Because while others debated policy, Bondi was preparing for something else entirely: a collision between public accountability and judicial immunity. And she wasn't coming for debate. She was coming for a reckoning. Pam Bondi didn't come to play defense. The night after Judge Elias Trenholm's order froze deportations, she sat across from news anchor Miles Castor under the cool lights of the American Public News studio in Atlanta. The show wasn't known for firebrand interviews, but that was exactly why she chose it. Bondi wanted her message to land where people still listened before shouting. Castor opened cautiously, asking if she viewed Trenholm's decision as legally defensible. Bondi smiled politely, the kind of smile that came before a storm. "He's not acting like a judge," she said, voice smooth. "He's acting like an unelected policymaker with a lifetime appointment." She let the words hang in the air unchallenged, then added, "And the American people are tired of judges who forget who they serve." The moment was clipped and posted within minutes. By dawn, it had 3.2 million views. Hashtags like Bench Overreach and Pam Strikes Back began trending. Conservative lawmakers rallied behind her, with one senator calling her a necessary check on judicial arrogance. Meanwhile, progressive legal circles decried her as dangerous, a political figure attacking judicial independence for clout, One op-ed in The Atlantic called her a walking constitutional crisis. But Bondi wasn't flinching. "I'm not undermining the courts," she told another outlet later that morning. "I'm exposing what happens when the courts undermine themselves." Behind the scenes, her team was moving fast. They drafted a 14-page memo, connecting Trenholm's ruling to a broader pattern of what they called activist interference, citing cases from the past year where judges had blocked executive orders on border enforcement, interfered with vaccine mandates, and even halted school discipline reforms. To Bondi, it wasn't coincidence, it was culture. "There's a mindset growing behind the bench," she said in a staff meeting. "They've stopped interpreting the law. They're rewriting it." It wasn't just about one case now, it was a campaign, a narrative, a confrontation. Bondi knew public sentiment could shift quickly, so every interview, every quote, every graphic her team released was part of a strategy to define the conversation before the other side could, and it was working. At the DOJ headquarters in D.C., senior staffers quietly debated how to respond. One official called it a brush fire we shouldn't feed. Another disagreed, "She's drawing blood. If we don't speak, it'll look like she's right." The White House press team flagged the issue as elevated. Meanwhile, legal scholars began writing anxious think pieces. Was Bondi going too far, or had the courts grown too comfortable? Bondi wasn't waiting for them to act. She appeared on 3 different networks within 48 hours. Her message didn't change, but her tone did. Quieter, sharper. "This isn't about policy disagreement," she said during one segment. "This is about discipline. Judges don't get to skip protocol because it feels right. That's not justice. That's improvisation." By the end of the week, she had what she wanted: momentum. Not everyone agreed with her, but everyone was talking about her. Judge Trenholm's name had become a lightning rod. And Bondi? She wasn't just challenging a ruling. She was rewriting the public's expectations of what judges were allowed to do, and how far someone could go to call them out. Judge Elias Trenholm had never sought the spotlight. In fact, he'd built his reputation on judicial restraint, measured rulings, tight language, and a near-clinical detachment from politics. He believed that the law spoke loudest when its interpreter said the least. But that detachment was being tested. Inside his chambers on the 19th floor of the Thurgood Marshall Courthouse in Lower Manhattan, the air was thick with tension and the faint hum of pressure that even polished walls couldn't keep out. His clerk, Naomi Chen, stood beside his desk holding a printed briefing. "You're trending again," she said without irony. Trenholm didn't look up from the ruling he was annotating. "Judges don't trend," he replied flatly. "Judges rule." Naomi hesitated, then laid the printout down. "They're calling you an activist. One headline even said you'd frozen national security." Trenholm finally glanced up, his jaw tightening. "They'll move on. They always do." But his voice lacked conviction, because this time, it didn't feel like something the media would forget by the next news cycle. This time, it felt like something more permanent. A shift not in the headlines, but in the way people looked at the robe itself. And that was harder to silence. Outside the courthouse, protests had grown larger each day on both sides. One group carried signs that read, "Hold the line, Judge T," while others chanted, "No bench for bias." The plaza had become a flashpoint, a theater of division with his name on the marquee. Cable news showed his face more in a week than in the previous decade combined. And now, thanks to Bondi's campaign, his decision wasn't just a matter of legal interpretation, it was being painted as a political strike. That's what rattled him most. Not the noise, but the suggestion that the robe no longer shielded him from perception. That objectivity could be questioned, not by the evidence, but by how it felt. Emails poured in, some praising his courage, others demanding his resignation. Former colleagues from the Justice Department reached out in quiet solidarity. A retired circuit judge from Boston warned him gently, "This isn't about the law anymore. It's about the wind shifting." Even inside his own courthouse, footsteps slowed outside his office. Glances lingered longer than they used to. Naomi closed the blinds that morning after a drone hovered near their window for nearly 20 seconds. The world outside had changed, and it was pressing against the chamber walls like never before. Still, Trenholm believed in his ruling. The deportation protocol had been rushed. Due process had been bypassed. That wasn't ideology, that was law. But law didn't go viral. Narratives did. And Pam Bondi was writing one faster than he could respond to. That night he stood by the window, staring down at Foley Square, where both supporters and detractors filled the plaza in equal voice. Naomi stepped beside him and said quietly, "They're not just watching, sir. They're waiting." Trenholm nodded, then whispered something she'd never heard from him before. "I just hope the law still matters more than the show." But deep down, he feared it already didn't. Pam Bondi never moved without a plan. The firestorm around Judge Trenholm's ruling had given her something rare in American politics: control of the narrative. And she understood something many of her rivals didn't. Outrage fades, but structure sustains. Moments like these didn't last unless you built a framework they could stand on. That Monday morning, her communications director, Paige Morales, handed her a thick folder stuffed with internal reports, ICE memos, and interagency emails. Bondi flipped through the stack in silence as they rode in a black SUV toward the press conference venue just outside Atlanta. "Don't lead with ideology," she said to Paige, eyes still scanning a redacted ICE memo. "Lead with receipts." The venue was a converted warehouse turned briefing center, chosen deliberately for its industrial look and tight acoustics. The press advisory Bondi's office had sent out was deliberately vague: Judicial, Overreach, and Public Safety, DOJ briefing. No big promises, no bombshells hinted. But the ambiguity only amplified the intrigue. Reporters had started arriving 2 hours early. By the time Bondi walked in, dressed in a slate-gray pantsuit, no jewelry, hair tied back, the room was at capacity. Cameramen perched on boxes, microphones lined the podium, recorders were already rolling. There was no teleprompter, no glossy banners, just a wireless remote in her right hand and a massive digital screen behind her. She walked up to the mic without greeting or preamble. The silence became anticipation. "This," she began, clicking to the first slide, "is what happens when the bench becomes a shield for dysfunction." The room blinked as an image appeared. An ICE report flagging a detainee as a known gang affiliate, deported in March but returned by June due to a clerical error the court failed to catch. "And this," she said, clicking again, "is the backlog it created. 57 cases delayed because judicial stays were issued with incomplete paper." Bondi didn't shout. She didn't need to. Her voice was flat, deliberate, and armed. Each slide tightened the room's attention. A redacted memo from the Department of Homeland Security, an internal email from a legal coordinator venting about the court's reversing enforcement actions without cause, a timeline showing how a single stay order had set off a domino effect that pushed over 200 hearings off the calendar. Then came the final slide, a graph, clean and brutal. Public confidence in federal courts. Declining trend since Trenholm's order. "This is not a personal attack," she said, pausing. "Judge Trenholm is a symptom. The system is the disease. And we're pretending that robes equal righteousness, even when evidence says otherwise." Gasps, shutters clicking, reporters started murmuring to each other. Some scribbled faster. She had said what no one in her position had dared to say publicly: that the judiciary had grown complacent, that power cloaked in tradition was still power without accountability, and that the public, once reverent, was now restless. Outside, the press coverage was instant. Cable news looped segments of her speech with flashing banners. Social media erupted, supporters using hashtags like "Fix the Bench," "Justice Not Privilege," and "Pam for Checks and Balances." Critics accusing her of staging a coup against judicial independence. But Bondi didn't care about either side's noise. Her strategy wasn't outrage, it was architecture. Later that night, back in her Atlanta office, she stood at the window overlooking the golden dome of the Georgia Capitol as the sun dipped low behind it. Her deputy, Alex Stinson, entered holding a tablet with the early polling numbers. "It landed," he said. "You're polling higher than you were during the vaccine showdown." Bondi didn't blink. She didn't celebrate. "We haven't even started yet," she said. "Well, Judge got the spotlight. Now we build the scaffolding." And so the crusade wasn't just born, it was branded, documented, weaponized, and for the first time in a long time, the bench wasn't the one asking the questions, it was being forced to answer them. Chief Justice Malcolm Raines sat alone in his chambers at the Supreme Court, the soft click of a grandfather clock the only sound in the room. In front of him was a printed copy of Pam Bondi's press briefing transcript. Every line highlighted, marked, and underlined. He had read it 3 times already, not because he disagreed with her every word, but because he recognized the deeper danger. Bondi wasn't just attacking a ruling or a judge, she was reframing the very definition of judicial accountability, and the public was listening. That made her more than a critic. It made her a contender in the court of public opinion. Worse, it made the courts look like they were hiding behind silence. And, in Raines's long career, he'd never seen public sentiment turn this fast or this sharply. Across the marble halls of the nation's highest court, a quiet crisis was building. Raines had called for a private convening of the Judicial Integrity Council, a select group of senior federal judges, no aides, no press, just 12 robes and one question: what do we do now? They met behind frosted glass in a secure room at the E. Barrett Prettyman Courthouse in D.C., far from cameras, reporters, and social media storms. The atmosphere was tense. These were not political rookies. They had seen confirmation hearings, mass protests, and viral outrage, but this felt different. This was internal, existential. Judge Alana Pierce from the 7th Circuit spoke first. "We underestimated her," she said, her voice low but firm. "She's not waving flags. She's drawing lines. And if we don't answer her, someone else will, louder and worse." A murmur of agreement followed. Judge Morales from Texas leaned forward, his brow furrowed. "Trenholm's silence is making it worse. People think silence means guilt, and frankly, we look complicit." But not all agreed. Judge Sutter from Colorado leaned back, arms crossed. "If we jump into the ring with her, we validate her entire premise. We let the public believe judges are fair game." The room stilled. The silence wasn't agreement, it was caution. Raines, who had remained silent throughout, finally raised his eyes from the transcript. "We are fair game," he said, not bitterly, not defensively, but with the slow gravity of someone admitting something aloud for the first time. "We were given trust, not immunity. And when that trust is shaken, we don't double down, we examine the cracks." He didn't call for a press conference. He didn't draft a public rebuke or signal a defensive PR campaign. Instead, he issued a request. Each judge would return to their district, quietly, and reflect. Where had they grown too comfortable? Where had the law become procedure, not service? Where had the robes grown too thick to hear the voices outside the courtroom doors? It wasn't a strategy, it was a reckoning. As the meeting adjourned, coats gathered and chairs scraped against polished floors, but Raines stayed seated, staring through the tall courthouse window. The pillars of justice still stood, but the marble no longer looked unshakable. The public wasn't just watching anymore, they were expecting answers, and this time, silence wouldn't be enough. What began as a political flashpoint was now rippling across dinner tables, classrooms, and coffee shops. Pam Bondi's message had broken containment. It wasn't just fueling headlines anymore, it was shifting the cultural mood. In Des Moines, a retired freight worker named Henry Barlow leaned over his breakfast counter and muttered to his wife, "She's saying what we all whisper." In a civics class at a high school in Indianapolis, a teacher paused mid-lecture and played a clip of Bondi's testimony, challenging students to debate whether judges should be held more publicly accountable. And in a crowded salon in Phoenix, 3 women waiting for appointments debated the role of judges in shaping policy, with one of them pulling out her phone to show a meme of Bondi standing in front of a gavel with the caption, "Silence is complicity." The conversation was no longer confined to policy wonks and legal circles. It had reached the people. At a farmer's market in Raleigh, a booth selling homemade honey put out a chalkboard sign that read, "Trust in the system is earned, not inherited." In a podcast recorded out of a garage in Detroit, 2 brothers, neither of them lawyers, spent an entire episode unpacking Bondi's now viral press conference. One of them said, "She's not asking us to hate the courts, she's asking if we even know what they're doing." Cable networks struggled to keep up. One poll from Gallup showed trust in the federal judiciary had dropped 5 points in a week. Even neutral media outlets began framing their segments with language like judicial transparency and public expectations. It wasn't that people had turned against the courts, it was that they had begun questioning their distance, their silence, their insulation. They wanted to know not just what judges were ruling, but why. Meanwhile, Bondi's team tracked every trend, every data point, every newscast. The strategy had worked. By broadening the conversation from one ruling to the idea of unchecked judicial power, she had made the courts vulnerable, not by force, but by exposure. And that was her genius. She didn't have to convince the entire country she was right. She only had to plant a question. What if the judges stopped listening? Inside the courts, some judges still clung to tradition. But others began to wonder if the old mantra, "We speak only through our rulings," had become a luxury of a more naive era. Because outside, the people were speaking. And this time, they weren't waiting for permission to be heard. The committee room in the Rayburn House office building was overflowing. Press elbow to elbow, aides whispering behind notepads, cameras tracking every movement. The hearing was titled Judicial Oversight and Public Trust, but everyone knew what it really was. Pam Bondi versus the system. Scheduled as a routine congressional hearing, it had morphed overnight into a nationally televised showdown. Bondi entered without flash, navy blazer, no makeup, tricks, a single leather briefcase in hand. The stillness that followed her walk to the witness table wasn't about decorum, it was anticipation. Congressman Raymond Yates, chair of the session, to order. His tone was cordial but laced with skepticism. "Attorney General Bondi," he said, "some say your campaign has politicized the courts. Others call it courageous. Which is it?" Bondi didn't flinch. "It's overdue," she said calmly. "We've spent too long pretending that questioning judges equals attacking justice. That ends today." She opened her briefcase and pulled out a thick binder. Redacted documents, FOIA-obtained emails, communications between Judge Trenholm's clerk and representatives from a legal advocacy group that had filed briefs in the very case he'd ruled on. One email included phrasing nearly identical to the language in his final opinion. "This," she said, holding up a page, "isn't an interpretation of law. It's coordination. And that's a violation of judicial ethics." The chamber shifted. Staffers exchanged sharp glances. One journalist mouthed, "Holy hell." Yates leaned forward. "You're alleging that Judge Trenholm's ruling was influenced by outside activists?" Bondi nodded once. "I'm not alleging it. I'm showing you the paper trail." The room exploded, metaphorically. Live broadcasts cut in across major networks. Twitter threads unfurled in real time. Legal experts began parsing the language on air. Even the New York Times ran a rare midday update. Bondi alleges unethical contact in federal chambers. Bondi wasn't finished. She pointed to another document. An internal ICE report revealing that key risk assessments had been delayed because of multiple emergency stay orders from Trenholm's court. "The law doesn't move in a vacuum," she said. "When judges hold up policy without due process, real people get hurt, not just detainees. Families waiting for closure, agents stuck in limbo, communities left confused." She paused. "I'm not here to attack the judiciary. I'm here because silence is complicity." That line landed like a thunderclap. On social media it was clipped and captioned within minutes. Cable anchors repeated it with emphasis. Memes, hashtags. The fire was uncontrollable now. The hearing adjourned amid chaos. Supporters of Bondi hailed her as a truth-teller. Critics called it a witch hunt with footnotes. But no one could ignore what had happened. The judiciary had been dragged into the public square, and this time not by its own ruling, but by someone who refused to let them speak, only through their silence. And in a courthouse miles away, Judge Elias Trenholm watched the hearing in his chambers, the binder mirrored on his own desk, his face unreadable. He reached for a pen, then stopped. Then reached again. For the first time in years, he wasn't sure what to write. Chief Justice Malcolm Reins had watched the entire hearing from a private room inside the Supreme Court, not flanked by advisors but alone, with only a legal pad and a growing sense of inevitability. The hearing had crossed a line, not in its content, but in its impact. Bondi hadn't just exposed a weakness, she'd exposed a silence. That night, without ceremony or press, Reins made an unscheduled appearance at the annual Judicial Ethics Conference in Chicago. There were no cameras, no teleprompters, just a room full of judges expecting an update on procedural reforms. What they got instead was a reckoning. Reins took the stage unannounced. His suit was wrinkled, his tie slightly askew, but his voice was steady. "We've told ourselves for years that we must remain above the noise," he began, "but the silence we kept to protect the court has become the very thing eroding trust in it." The room fell completely still. Judicial independence doesn't mean immunity from questions. It means we must hold ourselves to a standard even higher than the public demands. He didn't name Bondi. He didn't mention Trenholm. He didn't have to. The message was unmistakable. "We answer to the Constitution," he said, "but we are seen through the eyes of the people. And if those eyes are filled with doubt, it is not enough to say, 'Trust us.' We must show why we are worthy of it." There was no applause, no fanfare, just nods, slow, conflicted, and deeply personal. In that quiet room, filled with judges who had for so long believed dignity was found in distance, Reins had done something they hadn't expected. He stepped into the storm, not to fight it, but to acknowledge it. And for many of them, that was the first step towards something they had avoided for far too long: accountability with clarity. Judge Elias Trenholm didn't call a press conference. He didn't release a statement filled with legal jargon or defiance. Instead, on a rainy Tuesday morning, a single-page notice was filed with the clerk of the Southern District of New York. Effective immediately, Judge Trenholm will take an indefinite leave of absence to preserve the integrity of ongoing proceedings. It was clinical, controlled, but beneath the precision, it said everything. The silence he had once believed to be strength had become a burden too heavy to carry. Inside his chambers, Naomi Chen watched him pack a few personal items: an old fountain pen, a photograph of his law school class, and a worn copy of the Federalist Papers. "You don't have to do this," she said quietly. Trenholm looked up, tired. "I already did," he replied. News broke within minutes. Bondi's office was ready. She stepped before the press outside the Georgia Capitol, cameras snapping, voices shouting. She raised a hand for quiet. "This is not a victory," she said firmly. "It's a warning. To every institution that has forgotten, the people are watching." She didn't gloat. There was no smile, just the weight of a woman who knew the campaign had moved from confrontation to consequence. Inside the Supreme Court, Chief Justice Reins read the filing with a quiet grimace. He had hoped for something more balanced, a measured response, a public forum, anything but this. Because while Trenholm's exit may have been a concession to pressure, it also marked a dangerous shift. The public had learned it could bend the courts, and now everyone, from Washington to Wichita, was asking what might come next. But for Bondi, this wasn't the end. It was the opening. The system had finally responded, however reluctantly, and she intended to ensure it didn't stop at one name, one judge, or one ruling. This wasn't about taking down Trenholm. It was about proving that even the most protected positions were no longer immune to scrutiny, and for better or worse, the country was listening. In the weeks following Judge Trenholm's departure, something subtle but unmistakable began to shift across the American judiciary. Court schedules resumed, rulings were issued, and legal arguments were made as always, but the tone was different. In Phoenix, a district judge named Evelyn Caro hosted her first-ever public Q&A session in the courthouse rotunda, answering community questions not with detachment, but with clarity. In Milwaukee, Judge Orenfeld began writing a monthly column in the local paper titled "Why We Ruled," breaking down recent decisions in plain English. And in Atlanta, a courthouse that once turned away all media requests began planning a transparency initiative. These weren't coordinated PR stunts. They were small signs that the walls between the judiciary and the public had thinned, and that the courts knew it. Meanwhile, Pam Bondi's movement had morphed from media spectacle into a coalition. Behind closed doors, she met with a half-dozen state attorneys general, proposing a task force on judicial accountability. Her tone had shifted too, less fire, more framework. "This isn't about vengeance," she said in one briefing, "it's about visibility." Public approval of the judiciary remained divided, but one thing was undeniable. People were talking about the courts in ways they hadn't before. The myth of untouchability was gone. Chief Justice Malcolm Reins, for his part, moved forward with quiet resolve. He approved new internal reforms on ethics training and community outreach, careful to frame them not as a concession, but as modernization. He attended smaller forums, answered harder questions, and urged other judges to do the same. Dignity, he told one group of federal clerks, isn't in the robe, it's in remembering who you serve. And for the first time in decades, both critics and defenders of the judiciary shared the same strange feeling. Something was actually changing. It wasn't loud, it wasn't perfect, but it was real. A new era wasn't declared from a podium. It had begun with discomfort, questions, and a single reminder spoken on national television: silence is complicity. And now, no one could unhear it. It happened in a hallway, without cameras, applause, or press. Pam Bondi and Chief Justice Malcolm Reins crossed paths during a national judicial symposium in Baltimore, both invited for separate panels, neither expecting the other. For a moment, the air between them held the weight of months of friction, fallout, and undeniable transformation. Bondi, in a tailored charcoal suit, carried a binder of notes under one arm. Reins' tie slightly loosened, held nothing at all. They slowed as they neared each other, the hallway clearing in their presence like the world knew not to interrupt. Bondi offered a nod, firm, acknowledging, not triumphant. Reins returned it with a pause, then a quiet, almost reluctant gesture of respect. No words were exchanged, none needed to be. They weren't adversaries anymore, but neither were they allies. They were two figures who had weathered a constitutional storm from opposite ends of the institution. Bondi had forced a conversation many believed was too dangerous to have. Reins had stood in the breach to make sure the system didn't collapse under the weight of that conversation. And both knew that the line between accountability and erosion was razor thin, and that they'd walked it. In the weeks that followed, their brief, wordless meeting became a kind of footnote told in whispers at law schools and courtrooms alike. They saw each other, people said, and they didn't flinch. It wasn't peace, it wasn't closure, but it was something else. Mutual recognition of the tension they'd both endured and the institution they'd both, in very different ways, tried to preserve. Outside, the symposium continued. Inside, the judiciary was still adapting. Bondi, now a household name beyond politics, was planning her next moves with a growing coalition. Reins, still in robes, remained a quieter force, but one now willing to speak when silence threatened to break trust. And somewhere in between them stood a question that neither could fully answer. What happens next when the people watching decide they want to be heard too? The story of Pam Bondi and Judge Elias Trenholm is a powerful reminder that trust in institutions is not static. It must be earned, protected, and renewed. At its core, the lesson is simple yet deeply unsettling. Silence from power is no longer interpreted as dignity, it's often seen as avoidance. Bondi's campaign struck a nerve not because it dismantled legal arguments, but because it asked the public a question they already feared the answer to. Are the people in power still listening? In a world where transparency is demanded and access to information is instant, even the judiciary, once the most insulated branch, can no longer afford to stand behind tradition alone. The law may speak through rulings, but the public speaks through perception. And when that perception turns skeptical, even centuries-old institutions feel the tremor. Bondi may be polarizing, but her challenge exposed a deeper truth. Accountability must evolve with the time. Judges are not above scrutiny, and public faith cannot be sustained by reputation alone. The lesson isn't that courts must bow to politics, but that they must never forget the people watching. Because in the end, democracy doesn't fail in a moment. It erodes, slowly, when no one's asking hard questions anymore.